Hello, and welcome to another Northstar Talks Politics. This episode shall be called Collaboration is Always a Choice. Resistance, note the nonviolent in parentheses here, is always an option. This was stimulated originally by reading an article in Mondevice. I don't get to read that much because my long COVID, I have very limited energy, but I try and read an article, maybe once a week or something, twice a week. That goes a little deeper in the superficial reporting that you get from various different sources. I dig deeper, find what is well written and insightful and not clearly propaganda. However, this sometimes you can read even propaganda with a critical eye, and this piece might be considered that. An article in Mondevice by Dong Bao Ngang Hong. Ha. This is a Vietnamese writer. She she starts off by being fiercely critical of the U.S. history of bombing Vietnam, obviously, and extends this as a natural extension of anti-imperialism to opposition to Israel's then bombing of Gaza in 2021. Note 2021. They've done this repeatedly. In fact, she gave a brief history of all the episodes of bombing, assassinations, and Israeli interventions, and it's like every 5 years, Israel goes in, they bomb, they kill a bunch of people. It's a genocide. If you don't think so, you really don't know the history of it. Just because the population, I recently had a esteemed friend who was like, oh, but the population has increased of Palestinians. Yes, it has. So has the population of Israelis. Genocide does not require that a population decrease. If you're murdering people, but there's a high birth rate between the bouts of murder, the population will still increase. But if you're pushing people into a smaller and smaller segment of land and trying to drive them out of a country entirely, it's only a matter of time. Already, Gaza has the third highest population density of any place on earth. This is only going to get worse as Israel sets up these settler colonies in the area, illegal land seizures, prevents people from building new homes. They're crowding people into less and less space. Eventually, the conditions of overcrowding and enforced poverty will cause the death rate to exceed the birth rate. Just because something is being done slowly and methodically doesn't mean it's not genocide. It might not be the hard genocide of, say, the Holocaust. It's not an attempt to wipe all Palestinians from the face of the earth, but it is a localized genocide, an attempt to remove the nearly all Palestinians from Israel. Indeed, there's even a question, really, of how long Israel will even allow those who are considered Israeli citizens and are treated as second-class citizens to remain within Israel, or whether those Palestinians will eventually be driven out as well when there's a future nationalistic regime after they've kicked all the Palestinians out who they don't consider citizens. Um, but this article, right? This article turns into an apologetic for collaboration with Israel. After fiercely criticizing after fiercely criticizing Israel in the article, the same author turns around and says Vietnam had to, those exact words, had to collaborate with Israel, with their defense industry and makers of surveillance programs and drones and such, to buy these things and engage in research exchange programs to deal with the quote expansionism of Beijing and US imperialism. Now, no, the person is seemingly trying to be even handed by criticizing both the US imperialism and what she's basically calling Chinese imperialism without using that word in the same breath. But it is very much an example of what any Marxist will quickly identify as petty bourgeois nationalism. So this individual um, is, of course, she identifies herself as petty bourgeois by identifying as coming from, or at least coming from such a family, because one's own status versus that one's family can often lead people to acting differently. If, say, your parents, your grandparents are of a certain class and you're of a different one. But the author herself maybe less influenced by our own work um, situation in relation to means brought in their family, who are physicians. And physicians are very often petty bourgeois. They own their own clinics. That is, they own the means of production very often with private practices. They often employ nurses, medical assistants, secretaries, etc. So they are small scale businessmen. This is the class that most traditionally associates with either fascism in advanced capitalist countries or with petty independence nationalism in third world countries like Vietnam. That is, um, they'll be anti US. They'll even work with the socialists for a time. But these sort of people will eventually, if left to their own devices, turn to fascism once they've cast off the shackles of imperialist oppression. This has happened again and again throughout history, and you always need to be wary of people like this. They don't have any real theory. The only thing that they understand is nationalism, the interests of their own country, and interests specifically their class within that country. They're not really concerned with the poor in their country so much as they're concerned with the comfortable upper middle class position that people like their families and sometimes them themselves have acquired. Um, and so the article, I've given you the author name. It was published June 14, 2021. You can read it yourself if you want. I'm not going to direct any more views of this article. I was that upset by the second half of the first half. Bait and switch seems great. And then the author goes on to make excuses and excuses and excuses for Vietnam doing all sorts of shitty and evil things in their foreign policy just because they, quote, have to resist China and the US. Sometimes the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Even if the author is right, that if Vietnam doesn't say collaborate with Israel, they might end up under China's thumb. That may be a better fate than collaborating with a genocidal regime. This is like people saying they had to collaborate with the Nazis to keep the Soviets at bay. They did not. The Finns did not have to invade the Soviet Union alongside the Nazis during World War II. The Romanians did not have to join the Axis powers. Japan did not have to have sort of alliance with Germany. Most people just consider them to be part of the Axis, though officially they weren't part of it. But understand that they were on the same side of World War II against democracy and against communism. You do not have to put the interests of your own country above the human species, the interests of the human species, and the greater good. Learning to think beyond borders, internationalism, is a key element of any socialist school of thought. And indeed, if any of you have ever seen a sci-fi, it's not a coincidence. Anything where humanity becomes a spacefaring species, humanity usually first unites the planet Earth. The question is, of course, whether that's going to happen through methods of empires like the United States just expanding until they eat up the whole planet, or people learning to put aside their nationalism and work together before it's too late. And yes, there's criticism to be made of China here too, but this was not a dialogue with China, this or even a specific reporting anything China was doing. This was the author in vague terms fear mongering over China to justify Vietnam buying weapon systems off of Israel. That was the real bottom line of the article after the criticism. Um, and again, people on the left should be very careful siding with people like this because they will turn around and stab you in the back in the end. Petty nationalists, petty bourgeois nationalists should not be trusted. Now, compare later in the Vietnam War, or at least overlapping with the end of it, event in history and something modern. This relates Pinochet's Chile and Evo Morales in Bolivia. Now, the theme of this episode, as I said, is collaboration is always a choice. That is not that you could always do it. I suppose it's always an option, but that it's a choice. It's not something you ever have to do. Resistance to imperialism, to authoritarianism is always an option, no matter what the cost. Uh, in Pinochet's Chile, well, let me go back a step. So Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile in 1970. It was a free and fair election. It was a multi-party system, so we won a plurality, so less than a majority, because the election was divided among three parties, of which his party won the greatest share of votes. So his party came in number one. There was another party that was just a little behind them in number two, and then there was a what would I call it? A Catholic populist party, um, actually similar to the Popular Party in Italy before the fascists took over there, which historically the communists failed to work with, and that allowed fascists to take over in Italy because for a time Italy had what was known as the Two Red Years, and the communists and the Catholic Party could have worked together to form a ruling coalition and keep people like Mussolini out of power, but they didn't. And the bourgeois, that is the billionaire class. So petty bourgeois are small businessmen. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're owners of shops at the lower end. Bourgeois are Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. Who's that guy that the far right people always complain about? Soros. These are billionaires. These are the bourgeois. They're a much, much smaller group, but they often try and work together with petty bourgeois along common interests against the mass of working people. In socialist theory, and this is not a perfect theory, but it's a lens to look at the world and criticize it through. You can move back and forth between Marxist, non-Marxist, capitalist, liberal, all sorts of different ways at criticizing look at the world. I will put out here I am a democratic socialist, so I do not agree with a lot of Marxist-Leninists, a lot of things, but I am also not going to sit there and agree with the capitalists. They are wrong about a lot too. Democratic socialism requires a unique kind of intellectual flexibility and a willingness to go to march to the beat of your own drummer, because there are very few democratic socialists in the world. There are tons of social democrats. There are a ton of communists. There aren't that many democratic socialists by comparison. But anyways, um, so Salvador Allende was elected. Free and fair election, 1970. Nixon, by the way, U.S. president, immediately started plotting. As soon as I forget, I think Nixon, that would be 72, was he elected, or was he already in office? I would have to double check the timelines. But Nixon, either as soon as he came into office or as soon as, let's double check. Uh, was it 68 or 72? 72. Oh no, serving from 1969. Okay, yeah, no, so it was the 68 elections. So yeah, it was as soon, that's what I thought it was. As soon as Salvador Allende won the election, before he even took office, Nixon started working with the State Department and formulating plans to undermine the Chilean economy, the Chilean government, and as Allende was coming into power, the CIA had already put in motion a plan to assassinate Rene Schneider, who is a constitutionalist general. To this day, there will be people trying to deny that this was really a CIA-sponsored assassination, even though there's proven payment records of $15,000 to the people who assassinated this guy. Came from CIA accounts through a variety of moving money around in front groups, but it was ultimately from the CIA. Ostensibly, it was a kidnapping attempt gone wrong rather than an actual assassination, but whether it was always intended as assassination or not, there was a lot of U.S. assistance to this. The CIA had originally considered backing a coup that was being concerned with the Chilean military. This guy was backing and supposedly decided not to back it, although you have to be very cautious. A lot of times U.S. documents claim they backed off a plan, then they go through with it anyways. It's just another layer of obfuscation that even Freedom of Information Act stuff doesn't often get through. There's a level of dishonesty sometimes in documents are provided, but whether the coup that he was opposed to or not, was specifically still backed by the U.S. The U.S. knew that he was a constitutionalist. He believed that Chilean military should not be choosing the leader of the country, and it was up to elections to do that. And so he would just stand against any U.S. attempt at regime change, which is what the CIA desperately wanted. So they assassinated Rene Schneider. That was 1970. So just to give you an idea of how, from the very beginning, the U.S. was already working to undermine democracy in Chile. 3 years later, in 1973, there was a US backed coup that put Augusto Pinochet in power, who then immediately brought in people from the University of Chicago, who known as the Chicago Boys, who were very much they'd acted as economic political advisors to the Nixon administration. They were also acting as Pinochet, very clear lines of connection of pushing neoliberalism on Chile's economy, undermining labor rights, stuff like that. Oh, you could even find PragerU views falsely trying to defend this, but no, it fucked over a lot of ordinary people in Chile, and the only reason that it isn't as clearly massively bad for ordinary people as it might have been is because the U.S., of course, stopped trying to undermine the Chilean economy once Pinochet was in power. And of course, that attempts to undermine the economy can do a lot of damage. It's not just a sign of the U.S. imperialism, how evil the U.S. is in foreign relations, at least the U.S. government. I'm an American. I'm not saying Americans are evil. I'm saying the U.S. government has been evil over and over. This was specifically Henry Kissinger, who helped plot and organize this, as he did the Indonesian genocide, the Bangladeshi genocide, the East Timor genocide. Kissinger is an evil bastard. And I mentioned the genocides that he's helped engage in U.S. diplomatic cover for. It's not that, I guess you could say he didn't organize those, but he made sure that the U.S. made excuses for them and provided weapons, kind of like the Gaza genocide. So Kissinger is an evil bastard and is dead now. So I'm sure Satan has a pineapple up his ass every day. There's, what is it? I thought that goes to a joke in the movie Little Nicky about Mussolini sticking a pineapple up Hitler's ass every day or something. Yeah, I'm sure Kissinger is right there with him now. Just as evil a bastard. He was a diplomat, so he didn't have as much power. He could have done even more damage if he was a leader of, a country. But Kissinger was one of the most evil people to ever live. Anyways, so there's a military takeover, a coup, 1973. Even the U.S. media can't hide the fact that it was a coup and doesn't attempt to as much. Um, but this could not have happened without a portion of the Chilean population acted as collaborators that supported this coup and helped make sure that the economy didn't, say, grind to a halt through mass strikes after it occurred. Kind of like, and draw a connection, if Trump does an authoritarian takeover of the U.S., there'll be a portion of the population that will probably continue to go into work every day, actually tacitly support what's happening, and allow the system to chug on. If you think that democracy is invincible in the United States and someone like Trump can't do basically a fascist coup, you're wrong. You're delusional. There's nothing to stop it because there will be a portion of the population to go along with it. And you don't need to fool all of the people all the time. You just need some of the people to work with you all the time. Compare this to the situation in Bolivia. The U.S. worked constantly to undermine Bolivia ever since Evo Morales and his, what was it, PAM? I wrote it down. MAS, sorry. Party something. Anyways, MAS. But movement towards socialism is what it loosely translates to. It's a democratic socialist government elected in Bolivia, somewhere Chile elected democratic socialist government. And the U.S. worked constantly to undermine it until 2019. The U.S. backed what was proven to be incorrect allegations of electoral fraud. There were numerous investigations. The credible ones and the majority of them showed this was bullshit. There are some people who still hold out and claim it was fraud, just like Trump still claims that he didn't lose the 2020 election. That's a lie, of course. Trump did lose the 2020 election, and there was no the opponent to the MAS legitimately lost the 2019 election, but the military and police carried out a coup in 2019. Uh, Janine Inez took leadership of the country. She claimed she didn't lift a finger to do it, but she did lose a court case uh, accusing her of helping to mastermind the coup for a reason. Um, she was a right wing senator, and to draw the connections to US imperialism, they're often overlooked. She completed her education from the age of 17 on with the Lincoln Institute. The Lincoln Institute is I can't really call it a far right or an alt right, but a Georgist, which is a libertarian, a right libertarian, uh, off right, I don't know, well to the right of the Republican Party, usually. Yeah, I guess you have to call that an alt right think tank based in Cambridge, Mass. For a time. Anyone who thinks Massachusetts is just a bastion of left wing politics is fooling themselves. There are a lot of right wing groups based there because no state in the U.S. is truly completely blue or completely red. There's shitty right wingers in Boston, and there are uh, dedicated left wing people fighting for better conditions in Texas. Anywhere you go in the U.S., you will find people on every side of the aisle. But the Lincoln Institute is, of course, like many of these groups, tacitly a tool of U.S. imperialism and a tool of U.S. billionaires. And Janine Inez associated with them. She worked as a television producer at a time, and to give you an idea of her family's wealth and background, she did not get paid a salary. Instead, the television company she worked for promoted her family's restaurant. To be able to live without taking a salary says something about your wealth and your status and your class, just to begin with. She's very much in bed with the rich, in bed with the elites in Bolivia, and in bed with U.S. imperialism because of the education she received from the Lincoln Institute. Um, and she took power after this coup, which it was a coup. U.S. media, corporate media, and the BBC still try and put coup in quotes, even after. Fine, you want to do innocent till proven guilty? All right, but she was proven guilty in a lawsuit, and they still put it in quotes because the U.S. corporate media will always, always, always side with right wing authoritarians who oppose and kick out socialists through undemocratic means over actual democracy. The media does not side with democracy. It is not. Um, Capitalism is not inherently pro democracy, and free markets do not encourage it. That's a lie told by the right. And it's nowhere more clear than examples like this, where the BBC and like CNN and stuff, to a lesser degree, will constantly try and cast doubt on the fact that this was a coup just by their choice of wording, titles, language, the same way that the Gaza genocide was infamously when Palestinians died. It wasn't Palestinians killed by Israel; it was Palestinians found dead. But when Israelis were killed, it was Israelis killed. The choice of language matters and is used to bias the audience, and that is what the U.S. media tried to do with this coup. Nonetheless, the Bolivian people would have none of it, and just a year later, well, the next calendar year, but it was more than 12 months. It was more like what, 19, 23 months or something later. There was an election that the authoritarian government that carried out this coup kept trying to delay, but under international pressure, Bolivia is a small country and has a hard time resisting that. There was elections, and the party that had been basically behind this coup was kicked out. There was a landslide victory against them. Um, Now, it's worth noting Evo Morales, who had at this point been in power for quite a while, and there have been allegations of corruption, had chosen to leave the MAS party, form a third party, somewhat akin to, say, Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose party, um, which does raise and call into question. He claimed that the MAS had lost its way and wasn't really dedicated to socialism anymore. Um, but the MAS candidate, but who's not Morales, won by a landslide victory. This was, did I? Oh yeah, I wrote it down here. Acre Catacora or Catacora or um, they won a landslide victory, defeating both the third Evo Morales, who ran again with his own political party, and the party that had been behind the coup. Um, so democracy returned in Bolivia, whether or not there may be issues with increasing levels of corruption and bureaucratization and moderation of the MAS party. That is a socialist party losing its way and becoming more and more friendly to capitalism. That's a frequent problem with democratic socialist parties, and that may have happened to MAS, but they won by a landslide and kicked out the what was essentially a U.S. puppet regime under Inez, who, if you see a picture of her, uh, not only is she's this right wing senator, libertarian, which is an idiotic ideology, Georgism to begin with, that tries to root from left all the time by pushing land value tax will solve everything. No, they're an ideology that wants to make the rich richer, deregulate. Do not trust them. But she clearly got part of where she did through her looks. Honestly, she even has the look of bimbo, and I'm not. This is not a matter of some kind of anti-feminism or bullshit. This is a matter of not liking people who get where they go in life and looks. To be a little even-handed, I'm going to say I had a roommate, guy, shitbag, got through a lot of places he did on his looks, and someone more famous, Trump's current president, J.D. Vance. That's his name, right? J.D. Vance. I am quite sure he's only gone where he is now on his looks. In part, he is a very handsome man, which is to say, I'm trying to be even-handed here. It doesn't matter male or female. Some people get where they are, not through brain power, not through leadership, but through being physically attractive. And I think this is part of what happened here, especially when she was younger. Um, maybe not, maybe it's through her family's wealth, but she's also white in a country that's not majority white, which calls into suspicion. Um, and her family's wealthy background, it calls into suspicion whether a lot of these Latin American countries have a kind of white upper class that oppresses the brown majority and thinks they're better because they're not brown. There's a lot of de facto segregation in Latin America that doesn't get talked about much, but it's there. And she would have been associated with that. Now, what happened in Bolivia would have been a wet dream in Chile. For, say, Pinochet to be forced to hold elections just the next calendar year after taking power in, say, 1974, which, would have been 4 years after 70 elections, to have been forced to hold elections again basically on time. I think it's every 4 years, every six in Chile, so maybe 76, to be forced to hold the next set of elections, maybe a couple months late, and have been kicked out of power by a landslide. That would have been a wet dream. But too many people in Chile chose to stop resisting. They chose to collaborate. And too many Americans in the West chose to collaborate with this king making this regime change to not, carry out series of endless protests. Compared to say, the Iran Contra scandal, which was like less than 10 years later in the 80s. Um, was it less than 10 or more than 10? Was it 84? That would be 11 years. Compare this to the Iran Contra scandal, where there was so much public pressure not to support the fascist Contra death squads that the U.S. Congress placed a prohibition on any form of financial support them, which Reagan then went around by selling weapons to Iran, taking the money from Iran, and basically laundering the money through drug smugglers, through collaboration with them, possibly through the CIA buying and selling drugs. This has been an accusation, and that helped feed the crack epidemic in LA. But definitely, they used the facilities and the airplanes and the airstrips of drug smugglers to move their money. That has been proven. Oliver North and such claimed he didn't remember, but there was a lot of investigative reporting that smoking gun, and So using drug smugglers, this money from illegal sale of weapons to Iran, because that was also not supposed to be allowed, was used to then fund the Contra death squads in Nicaragua to kick out the Sandinistas. But Reagan had to do that because there was public pressure not to support the Contras. If there had been more public pressure to oppose Pinochet in the 70s, people recognizing that it was part of the same struggle as ending the Vietnam War, then perhaps democracy would have returned to Chile and Pinochet wouldn't have been pushing people out of helicopters and murdering leftists left and right and carrying and forming concentration camps and carrying out mass torture for more than what a decade. I think he was in power a long time. Um, yeah, he had like concentration camps for trade unionists and leftists, and he tortured people. People would disappear in the night, and they'd be tortured for like a week and then released. Sometimes he would release them in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. A few of them managed to swim to shore and seek asylum in other countries. So this is how we know what happened to these people. But a lot more drowned out at sea, almost certainly. Evil murder, Pinochet, and he could have been maybe removed from power if more in the West had opposed him and people in Chile had not given up resisting. Um, to the now, and of course, to this day, there are apologetics for Pinochet in U.S. media, especially from right-wing think tanks, but even sometimes the mainstream media goes soft on him because, as I said, capitalist media will always side with anti-socialist right-wing authoritarians. Capitalism is an evil ideology, and this is where it leads. Uh, it's the same ideology that's now, to bring back to my own life, I am disabled with long COVID and has found a million ways to screw over people who are disabled at a young age with long COVID, from work requirement rules that increased right up to 31 and then plateaued to 42. Why to 42? Because there's a sort of favoritism for middle-aged people and people in their like late 30s that isn't being shown for people in the early 30s and 20s. Uh, and then there's no credit given for graduate school, even though more and more people need to go to graduate school. And in fact, if you work during graduate school, as I did, the university will often get off not paying their payroll tax. You can't earn SSDI from the job you're doing. You may be working 40 hours a week and doing graduate school, but you won't be earning any work credits despite working, contributing, as a worker to the economy, and doing a graduate education to try and make something more of yourself, and you won't be earning work credits and you get screwed out of Social Security, which is what's happened to me. Um, Government's doing that with 14.5 million Americans long COVID and growing, and 144 plus people worldwide, 144 million plus people worldwide. That's a estimate from 2 years ago, March 2023, that was already based on somewhat older data. And it had replaced the estimate of 65 million people worldwide, which was too low to begin with, and the number had already grown between those two estimates because more people get long COVID every month, day, year. Um, so we have a government that's doing that. We have a government that has supported the Gaza genocide. We have a government that erases third world exploitation and sweatshops and basically child labor and modern slavery in Congo. Whereas, by the way, there is a U.S. and British supported genocide going on in the East Congo, which is what creates the conditions in the West Congo where cobalt is mined at very, very low cost because the government is overstressed trying to and deal with the genocide in the eastern part of the country, which is being funded by Rwanda, which is a tiny country, could not do this on their own, but the British and Americans, especially the British, are pushing money through Rwanda. This tiny little country is essentially a front to control the gold, diamonds, other natural resources in eastern Congo, and using genocide, sorry, my brain, using a genocide to create the conditions of cheap exploitation to get blood diamonds, to get gold very cheaply, that kind of thing, in the eastern Congo. And this has the Congolese government's hair is on fire, so they're enforcing labor rights in the West, which is leading mainly U.S. companies to have slave labor-like conditions in West Congo, though there is a Chinese company doing mining there too. They don't actually mine cobalt, though, and all evidence points to them having better labor standards than U.S. companies. Of course, better is a relative term. U.S. companies might be paying, $2 a week, and the Chinese companies might be paying 5, but those are still not livable wages, and they might not be beating people at the Chinese mines, but they're still uh, not taking very good care of their workers. Um, this is where capitalism leads. So resist. It's always an option. I am calling for nonviolent resistance because one, that's all I can legally call for, and two, violence is often self-defeating and makes things worse, not better. Um, Perhaps you dislike my pacifism. I'm not going to push that aggressively on you. There would be a great irony in being an aggressive pacifist, and for all I know, I may be incorrect in my views on pacifism. What I will say, though, is that peaceful legal protest is always an option. Resistance, pushing for things like it's an atrocity in the U.S. that general strikes and secondary strikes are illegal. People need to be able to use their withhold their labor to actually destabilize the system where we have no real power, where you have two parties you can vote for and they're both controlled by the billionaires, where um, protests are often tamped down on by police and declared illegal when they shouldn't be, and get beat by police. Protesters often get beat and arrested on bullshit reasons that are made up by corrupt police officers. Um, so Americans need to be able to hold secondary strikes. It was challenged and ruled on certain lines to be unconstitutional, the ban on secondary strikes, but it's never been completely removed. So it ends up being discretion on the law versus a Supreme Court case, I believe it was, that limited the extent of that law and how enforceable it was, but it didn't completely remove it. So in some situations, you might be able to do secondary strikes. You need to consult a legal expert, but they should never be illegal. It's wrong that under any situation it can be treated as illegal. And that's the only way that people are going to have the power to actually stop the fascist slide in the U.S. and to oppose the increasingly destructive neoliberal capitalism that is killing the planet through climate change, is killing millions of Americans, is killing tens, hundreds of millions of people worldwide. So, anyways, never stop resisting. Remember, collaboration is a choice. It's never mandatory. You can always choose, even if it seems like the price of not collaborating is too high. You may be wrong. There's always uncertainty about the future and a tendency of those who wish us to go on with the system to exaggerate the costs and not go on with them beyond what they can actually do to you. Just remember that. Well, anyways, I wish you all the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. And viewers, may always find a guiding star to lead you home. Till next time, adieu.